Okay, let's dive in. We got quite a bit to unpack today based on these sources.
Yeah, a lot of material. We're looking at everything from Pew research on public opinion, reports on policy impacts.
Economic and social impacts, right?
Yeah.
Plus the recent events in Los Angeles, the National Guard deployment.
And the legal analysis around presidential power in these situations. It's quite a mix.
So our mission here is to really cut through the noise, pull out the key insights, the surprising details, and help you make sense of it all.
Absolutely. It's a complex picture. We'll cover public views on deportation, federal actions, the proposed funding, which is pretty striking.
And also that other perspective, right? The claimed impacts on families, communities, and then tackle the legal side of that LA National Guard deployment.
Exactly. So where should we start? Public opinion seems like a good place. What are Americans thinking about enforcement, especially deportation?
Well, the Pew data from earlier this year, March 2025, it gives us a pretty clear snapshot. And it's definitely not a unified view.
Not at all. About half, 51%, say some immigrants here illegally should face deportation.
Okay, some. But there's nuance within that, isn't there?
Right, because within that group, saying some, there's a big chunk, almost a third of all adults, 32%, who actually say all should be deported.
Wow, okay, a third. And then the rest.
Then you've got 16% saying none should be. So, opinions are really spread out.
And does it matter who we're talking about deporting? Does the consensus shift?
Definitely. For those who favor some deportations, there's almost total agreement, like 97%, on deporting immigrants who've committed violent crimes. That seems pretty clear-cut for most people.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about other situations?
Well, it gets more divided. Support for deporting those with nonviolent crimes, that drops to about 52%.
So it's over half.
Yeah. And for those who arrived more recently, say in the last 4 years, support for deportation is even lower, around 44%. So the specifics really matter to people.
But here's the thing that really stands out. And frankly, it's probably not a huge surprise. The partisan divide the sources highlight, it's stark.
Oh, absolutely. It's huge. That same Pew data shows a majority of Republicans and Republican leaners, 54%, say all immigrants here illegally should be deported.
54%. And Democrats.
Just 10%. 10% of Democrats and Democratic leaners say all should be deported. That's a massive 44-point difference.
The real chasm. And it extends beyond just who should be deported, right? It's about how enforcement happens, too.
Exactly. Like, should police be able to check immigration status during routine stops? Republicans are much more likely to say yes, 81%.
81% versus
only 33% of Democrats. Again, a huge gap in views on basic enforcement practices.
And what about where arrests happen? The sources mentioned sensitive locations.
Right. Most U.S. adults overall think arrests shouldn't happen in places like churches or synagogues, places of worship, basically. 65% are against that.
Schools and hospitals, too.
Yeah, similar numbers. 63% against arrests in schools, 61% against them in hospitals. There seems to be a general feeling these places should be off limits.
But other locations are viewed differently.
Yes. Majority say arrests should be allowed at protests or rallies at 66% support, in homes, 63%, and workplaces, 54%.
Okay, but again, does the partisan lens change that picture dramatically?
Dramatically. For Republicans, support for arrests is sky high in those locations. 89% support arrests at protests, 84% in homes.
89% of protests, wow.
And maybe most strikingly, 52% of Republicans even support arrests at places of worship.
Over half compared to Democrats.
Much lower. Only 15% of Democrats support arrests at places of worship. Right. And support is lower across the board, 44% for protests, 44% for homes. It just underscores how differently the parties view the boundaries of enforcement.
And the sources also mentioned a historical note about the previous administration.
Yeah, just context, really. 75% of Democrats felt the Trump administration was doing too much on deportations, while only 13% of Republicans felt that way. It shows this tension isn't exactly new.
Okay, so public opinion. Clearly divided, deep partisan splits. Let's pivot now to what the federal government is actually doing, and maybe more importantly, planning to do. We heard about recent raids.
Yes, the sources confirm that. Widespread ICE raids in Los Angeles back in June 2025, hundreds detained there, and it was part of a larger nationwide effort. Sources say thousands arrested daily.
Thousands daily. And they're using specific legal tools.
The sources mention the administration using things like the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
That sounds old.
It is. It's historically been used during wartime against citizens of hostile nations. The sources note its application here, particularly targeting alleged gang members, is notable.
And this is happening against a backdrop of, well, fluctuating border numbers, but still millions of encounters recently.
Right. Encounters peaked in 2023, dropped a bit in 2024, but still millions since 2021. And you have that large estimated population, around 11 million immigrants without authorization as of 2022.
Including people with things like DACA or TPS.
Exactly. And the sources point out that those protections, TPS and DACA, can be revoked by the administration. So the potential scope of enforcement is very large.
But what really caught my eye in the source material was the proposed funding for enforcement. The numbers seem huge.
Huge is an understatement. Eye-opening, really. Legislation moving through the House in late April 2025 proposes something like $80 billion just for IC.
$80 billion for immigration and customs enforcement over what period?
Between fiscal year 2025 and 2029, so 5 years.
Okay, $80 billion over 5 years.
Yeah.
How does that compare to now?
Well, ICE's budget in FY 2024 was around $9 billion. So this proposal is nearly double the current annual budget, averaged out over each of the next 5 years. It's a massive increase.
And where is that money going? The sources broke it down, didn't they?
They did. About $45 billion is earmarked specifically to increase detention capacity.
$45 billion just for detention space.
Yeah. One source calculated that this amount alone is 13 times the entire FY 2024 budget for detention.
13 times. Just for detention expansion over 5 years. That signals a major strategic shift, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests a plan for a vast expansion of detention capabilities. And it's not just detention. There's $14.4 billion proposed for transportation and removal.
Who's getting people out of the country?
And $8 billion to hire more staff ICE officers, other personnel. The goal mentioned is a 50% increase in ICE staff by 2030.
And this isn't just ICE, right? CBP funding is also slated for big increases.
Correct. The proposed legislation includes huge sums for customs and border protection, too, like $46.5 billion specifically for border wall construction.
$46 billion for the wall, plus more for staff and facilities.
Billions more, yes. One source analyzing these proposals described them as aiming to dramatically expand the federal government's capacity to carry out what that source termed its anti-immigrant agenda. It points towards a really significant long-term buildup of enforcement infrastructure.
Okay, so we have divided public opinion, a federal push for massively increased enforcement capacity.
Yeah.
But the sources also bring in another angle, the impact on people, on communities.
Right. And this offers a very different perspective. The sources show a significant level of worry, especially among Hispanic adults. 42% worry about themselves or someone close being deported.
That's a high level of anxiety. Does it change how people behave?
The sources suggest it does, though maybe in small percentages overall. About 4% report carrying documents more often. Perhaps more concerning, about 2% report avoiding public services, like healthcare.
Avoiding healthcare out of fear.
Out of fear of detection, yeah. One source explicitly argues these enforcement practices impose heavy social costs. They talk about families being torn apart, trust between communities and law enforcement eroding.
And there was mention of a chilling effect.
Yes, that's a key concept highlighted. This chilling effect describes the fear that stops immigrant families, especially mixed-status families, where some are citizens or legal residents and others aren't, from accessing services they might be legally entitled to.
So even citizens in the family might miss out on healthcare or nutrition programs.
That's the argument presented in the sources. The fear of exposing an undocumented family member leads the whole household to withdraw from public life, potentially causing negative health outcomes, isolation, educational impacts on kids.
And economic impacts, too. Deporting earners must have consequences.
Severe ones, according to the sources. Housing instability, kids' well-being, suffering. And one source looks specifically at California's economy.
What did they find?
They estimated immigrants contribute over $1 trillion to the state's economy, with undocumented immigrants paying billions in state and local taxes.
So the argument there is that mass deportations would actually harm the economy.
Precisely. By removing workers, consumers, taxpayers. That source argues immigrants fill vital jobs and even create jobs for native-born workers. It's a strong counter-narrative focused on economic contributions and the potential damage of large-scale enforcement.
Okay, so clear arguments about human and economic costs sitting alongside this push for more enforcement. Now let's get into that specific incident in L.A., the National Guard deployment. The sources really dug into the legal aspects here.
Yeah, this was a major point of friction. After the ICE raids and the protests that followed, President Trump ordered 2,000 National Guard troops into Los Angeles.
And his justification, according to the sources.
He framed the protests as lawlessness threatening federal immigration enforcement. He even used the term rebellion.
Rebellion. Strong language.
Very. He also blamed paid troublemakers and criticized Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass as incompetent for, in his view, failing to control the situation.
But critically, the sources emphasize he didn't use the main legal tool for this, the Insurrection Act.
Correct. The Insurrection Act is the primary law allowing the military for domestic law enforcement, overriding the usual posse comitatus act restrictions. He didn't invoke it.
So what legal basis did he use instead? This is where it gets tricky, right?
Very tricky. The analysis points to him relying on a more limited, inherent executive power, the protective power, to use troops to safeguard federal property and functions.
Okay, the protective power.
He combined that with a specific statute, 10 U.S.C. 12406, which allows mobilizing the Guard if there's a rebellion or threat of one.
And the significance of using this combination instead of the Insurrection Act.
The key point the sources highlight is that this approach potentially allowed him to bypass needing Governor Newsom's consent.
Acting unilaterally without the state's agreement.
Which is rare for domestic Guard deployments and often legally challenged. Normally, you need the governor's request, or you use the Insurrection Act, which has its own criteria that might override consent. This protective power route was different.
How did the state officials react?
Strongly. Governor Newsom called it purposefully inflammatory, risking escalation, basically saying the feds were taking over. Mayor Bass said it was completely unnecessary, that LA could handle it.
And there was a comment from Tom Homan mentioned.
Yeah, described as Trump's border czar. He apparently stated that officials interfering with ICE, including the governor or mayor, could face arrest. That really shows the high-stakes intention.
Does the legal analysis say what the Guard's role should be under this protective power? Is it limited?
Yes, the analysis emphasizes it's much more limited than the Insurrection Act. Their activities should stick to things like protecting federal buildings and personnel, ensuring access to federal workplaces, maybe some crowd control consistent with rights, but not general policing of the public.
The sources put this in historical context too, didn't they? Comparing it to past uses of the military domestically.
Right. They mentioned Eisenhower and Kennedy using the Insurrection Act against governors' wishes during desegregation. Contrast that with George W. Bush not federalizing the Louisiana Guard during Katrina because the governor objected.
And the LA riots in '92.
Back then, Governor Pete Wilson actually requested federal control. So this 2025 LA deployment, using the protective power potentially without consent, is presented as a different kind of scenario in this ongoing federal-state dynamic.
It really highlights the complexity of these legal powers and how they can create major friction between federal and state government.
Absolutely.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big picture from this deep dive? We've seen profound splits in public opinion, very partisan splits, based on that Pew data.
Yeah, clear divisions there. And we've seen a strong signal from the federal government through those massive proposed funding increases towards dramatically ramping up enforcement capacity.
But we've also explored the counterarguments presented in the sources, the potential human costs of the community impacts, the economic arguments, that whole chilling effect.
And finally, the real-world complexities when these policies meet the ground, like in LA with the National Guard, raising thorny legal questions about presidential power and federal-state relations.
It paints a picture of a nation really grappling with immigration enforcement, with policy driving significant investment in one direction while raising serious concerns and legal challenges in another.
It's a landscape defined by division, proposed expansion of federal power, and ongoing debate about the consequences.
Which leaves us with a crucial question for you to think about. As this debate continues, and as federal enforcement efforts potentially scale up, how will that balance shift? The balance between federal goals, state and local concerns about impacts and authority, and that intricate legal framework around using military force at home, how will that continue to evolve?